Hey guys, tonight we've got creepy stories straight from Reddit that'll make you think twice before turning off the lights. Some things just can't be explained, and this one might just keep you up at night. So, let's get into it. My son keeps talking to the audience. My son Cade is smart. He's only 6 years old, halfway through the first grade, and he's already begun reading books that even I struggle to get through. He's a sharp kid, but he has some quirks. And listen, all kids have quirks. One thing I've learned as a relatively new father is that kids are weird. They talk to the walls, eat bugs, see things in the reflection that aren't there. You get the gist. Kids really do the darndest things. But recently, my son has reached a new level of oddity. One that is out of my jurisdiction as the oblivious goofball dad who still makes hot dogs for every meal. I became a single parent after my wife passed a few years back. It's been impossibly difficult. I won't sugarcoat it. Being the sole caretaker of Cade has been the single hardest thing I've ever had to do next to attending my wife's funeral. Cade, though he was only 4 at the time, took his mother's passing hard. He would ask for her constantly, throwing wild fits, thrashing around like a fish out of water. At any minor inconvenience, he would beg for his mother. I didn't know how to handle it. He'd often throw tantrums in public, wailing like a banshee in Home Depot as passers-by would stare with judgment, spilling out of their wide eyes. I felt utterly helpless. All I could do was attempt to calm him in a hushed tone, promising that Daddy was there to help him. But Daddy was not enough. Every child needs their mother. I remember wishing I had the funds to take Cade to see a child psychologist, or at least a licensed medical professional. I work in construction and barely make enough to pay each month's rent, let alone provide health care for my poor son. Looking back now, I should have downsized so I could afford it. Cade's explosive fits continued until about a few months ago. These tantrums would occur every other day, if not daily. Then, suddenly, they dwindled to once a week. Then, after another month, none at all. I was relieved, to say the least. It was a weight off my chest to avoid the pointed glares from strangers on the street as I'd haul a hysterical Cade into the car, practicing the patience I didn't know I had until fatherhood. But once Cade's meltdown ceased, a new issue presented itself. One that scared me far more than any tantrum I've seen him throw: imaginary friends. I know what you're thinking. Every kid has imaginary friends, and you're right. But Cade's imaginary friends were a little bit different. He called them the audience. It began one night during dinner when I had the bright idea to saute some spinach alongside boiling the usual hot dogs in hopes Cade would get his greens in somehow. I scooped a heap onto his plate and placed it in front of him, beckoning him to try. "It's good," I said, feigning a smile. "Popeye eats it to get big and strong." Cade looked at the plate, quizzically, looked at me, and looked back at the plate. He sat there for a while, staring the spinach down as if we're the innards of an alien creature. He looked at me again as if I might be crazy, then pushed the plate away. "No, thank you." "Cade," I said warningly, my dad voice making an appearance, "you have to at least try it." Cade made a humming noise, as if pondering this deeply, and began to stroke his chin. "I'm not sure," he had said finally. "Let me ask the audience." Cade turned to face a window next to the kitchen table. The window faced our backyard, though dusk had long since departed. The outside world was dark as doom. My son, staring out into a window of nothingness, appeared as if he were simply looking at his reflection. The lights in the kitchen and the contrasting darkness outside created a mirror-esque effect. What do you think? There was deafening silence for a moment. I arched an eyebrow, waiting for the imaginary response from this mysterious audience. It was the first time I'd heard him mention them. I figured it was his new, foolproof method of avoiding any vegetable consumption that evening. After a moment too long, Cade turned back around to face me. "They said no." I scoffed and gestured to his plate once more. "I'm sure they did. Now go on, have a bite." "No, I can't. I'm not allowed," he said again. "Cade, knock it off. Please eat your spinach." "No, Daddy. They said no." I had assumed he would whine like he usually did when he didn't get his way. But this time, his tone sounded different. Desperation clung to his voice, as if he were begging me to understand. I dropped it. I was too tired to fight him. He went to bed with a belly full of hot dogs, unaccompanied by sautéed spinach. Unfortunately, the audience wasn't as easy to get rid of as a plate of boiled hot dogs. The following week, Cade's imaginary friends made an appearance once again. I was trying to get Cade in his pajamas for bedtime. The usual routine went: pajamas, teeth brushing, bedtime story, lights out. Always the same order. But tonight was different. Cade decided to brush his teeth before changing into his pajamas. "What about PJs, buddy?" I asked him, curious about his change in routine. He had been doing this bedtime routine the same way since before my wife passed. I imagined the routine was comforting to him, reminding him of when my wife was still around, which is why it was so odd that he had decided to switch things up suddenly. "The audience told me to do it this way now," he replied with a mouth full of toothpaste froth. There they were again. The audience. A sudden curiosity crept into my mind. Why? Cade glanced at his open bedroom window quickly. "I don't know. They just did." A sudden chill ran down my spine. I hadn't remembered those curtains being opened. Curtains are always closed before bedtime routine. I walked to the window and pulled them shut. After story time, when it was time for lights out, Cade refused to let me touch the light switch. "Dad, the audience wants the lights on." Cade cupped his tiny hands over the switch against his bedroom wall, creating a makeshift barrier, refusing to budge. I rolled my eyes. "Nice try, Cade. But the audience doesn't get to decide the rules." Fear flashed on Cade's face as he snapped his head to look at me, wide-eyed. "Don't say that, Daddy." His calm tone was eerie, and I took a step backward. "Cade, please. You can't stay up all night just because the audience told you to." "Yes, I can," Cade responded, his voice low. He was staring at the window, curtains closed and all. At this point, I was thoroughly unnerved, if I'm being honest. Something in my gut was telling me these imaginary friends were not very friendly. Not just an excuse to get out of vegetable eating, but an excuse for Cade to be up to no good. Even still, I had paternal duties to attend to. "Well, tell the audience to say goodnight." I scooped Cade into my arms despite his pleas and tiny fists of rage. I placed him gently on his bed and made my way towards his bedroom door, flicking the light switch off, signaling he had no choice in the matter. The lights in Cade's room remained on. I stopped in my tracks, spinning around, trying the switch once, twice, 3 times again. The lights didn't turn off. The switch must have been broken somehow, I thought. Despite my rational explanation for the phenomenon, the panic that began to bubble in my chest did not subside. "You're sleeping with me tonight." The next morning, the light switch started working again, and I was able to exhale the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. But that feeling of relief didn't last long, as the week that followed was filled with even more peculiar coincidences. I say peculiar, but I think a more suited adjective would be horrifying. On Friday, Cade said, "The audience doesn't want him to go to school." I get a flat tire on my way to drop him off. On Monday, Cade says the audience doesn't like Jacob because he hogs the soccer ball during recess. On Tuesday, Jacob falls and breaks his arm. He'd be out of school for 2 weeks. On Thursday, Cade says the audience doesn't like Mr. Teddy, Cade's favorite stuffed animal, anymore. Mr. Teddy is found slashed open from the belly up, fluffy guts spilling from his abdomen. I began having trouble deciphering whether this was Cade's new method of acting out or if there was really some ominous force at play. I could have rationed each occurrence away by blaming Cade, but I knew in my soul that Cade wasn't that kind of kid. He was sensitive and bright. He was no teddy bear killer. The audience began to infiltrate my thoughts more than I would have liked it to. It was all Cade talked about, and more often than not, the audience would lead Cade down the path of destruction. Everything came to a head this past Saturday night while I used the bathroom, leaving Cade unattended in the living room, watching an episode of his show. As I was washing my hands, I heard a loud crash, followed by a glass shattering. I ran to the living room and found Cade, looking guilty as ever, standing next to a wedding picture of my wife and me, glass scattered across the hardwood floor, smashed to bits. My instinctual response was to make sure he wasn't hurt, which, thank God, he wasn't. But afterward, an inexplicable anger coursed through me. "Cade, why would you do something like that?" "It wasn't me. It was them. The audience..." Go to your room, I shouted, and Cade scurried up the stairs in tears. After a few minutes of feeling consumed with guilt, I started towards his room to apologize. I stood in front of the doorway for a moment, preparing myself for a long apology, when I heard Cade's voice. He was talking to himself in his room. Well, he was speaking to someone, but I heard no response. But I don't want to do that, I heard him murmur. I love my daddy. I walked into Cade's room the second I heard him referring to me, and he looked spooked, like I had caught him with his hand in the cookie jar. He was positioned by the window, kneeling, facing the blackness of the night beyond. I could have sworn I saw something moving by the window, a figure cloaked by the lightless sky. Cade, I said slowly, who are you talking to in here? Cade didn't respond. Instead, he got to his feet, arms hanging by his sides, and dramatically flopped onto his bed, face pressed into the mattress. This was Cade talk for, get the hell out of my room. Though I was still fixated on the window, exposed by the open curtains, I snapped out of my trance to focus on my priorities. Cade, I say softly. Daddy is very sorry for yelling. Cade let out a but kept his face against the mattress, refusing to look at me. Is there something you want to talk about? Maybe a reason why you're feeling sad? I tried to coax it out of him, but he wouldn't budge. It wasn't me, he had said, his voice muffled by the bedding. It was them. You didn't break that picture of Mommy and I? No, it was them. His voice cracked and he lifted his face, tears spilling down his cheeks. They're everywhere, Daddy. I don't like them anymore. Who, Cade? Who is everywhere? Cade was practically choking on his sobs now. The audience. They told me that you don't like me anymore because Mommy died. They told me Mommy got sick and lost all her hair, and now she's in the ground. Sweetheart, I take a deep breath, attempting to steady my voice. There's no such thing as the audience. They're imaginary. They're not going to get either of us. You're safe and sound here with me. I pulled him into a hug, squeezing him tightly as if to show this audience they were not taking away my Cade. They're real, I heard him whisper, his head buried in my shoulder. That night, I lay with him in bed until he fell asleep. I was careful not to wake him as I kissed his rosy, tear-streaked cheeks goodnight, ensuring he was finally out. I felt at peace knowing he was tucked in bed, safe. I made my way downstairs to tidy up the kitchen, cleaning the pile of stray dishes left from dinner. I went over to the sink and began scrubbing. I'd only gotten through maybe 3 or 4 when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I froze instinctively, fixating on the pan in the sink, mid-scrub. There was something in the window, something my intuition was screaming at me not to look at. It was peeking at me, rising slowly into my peripheral vision. I felt the hairs on my arms rise, a chill running through me. Something was right in front of me, standing in front of the window. I couldn't bring myself to look. If I'm being completely honest, I was scared shitless. I could feel it staring at me, its eyes burning into the top of my head. I was afraid that if I acknowledged it, it would truly and entirely exist. In my motionless trance, I felt them begin to appear. They were all around me, their presences one by one, being made known in front of every window of the house. This was their debut. I could feel each one in my bones peering at first, then slowly rising in front of each open window in our home until they had reached their full length. Then they were all around me, staring at me through a thin sheet of glass. It was only a matter of time. I couldn't move, aside from my shaking hands, still clutching that bubble-soaked pan in the kitchen sink. All I could think about was my son. Cade was still upstairs. I couldn't abandon him. These things had been tormenting him for weeks, and now was my chance to put a stop to it, to protect him. I knew I had only one option at this point. I sprang into action, launching myself from the kitchen sink and racing to my son's room. I saw them in the windows. They didn't move, didn't even flinch, as I bounded up the stairs. They were colorless blurs as I ran past them, realizing then, and only then, that my house had far too many windows. I nearly tore Cade's door off of his hinges, finding him sleeping peacefully in bed. That's where we've been for the past few hours, hiding under his covers, waiting for this nightmare to end if it ever does. All I know is this: if your kid ever tells you they're talking to the audience, run. Every summer, my neighbor built a new scarecrow. The rural area I grew up in made the smallest towns appear densely populated. It was the sort of place where you had to cycle a mile or so to the nearest neighbor, and the bus only came through twice a day. Most kids think growing up on a farm is some sort of constantly thrilling adventure. The kids at my school in the nearest town certainly did. They didn't see me waking up at 4 in the morning just to get ready in time for my parents to get me there, or how lonely weekends were when your friends lived so far away. No, they thought it was all just chickens and tractors. In truth, I resented it. The farm was on a large plot of land. We had acres surrounding the house, ending at a thick forested border that separated us from two distant neighbors and some fields. My parents would let me play freely on the farm from a young age. My only rule was to stay on the land that we owned. Where the trees started, I should have always stopped. Boredom was a killer. Chickens aren't so exciting when they're your day-to-day life. And there's only so much fun a kid can have on his own. When I was about 8 years old, I started to explore the woods that made up the border, at first weaving in and out of the trees on the edge of the farm, and eventually building up the courage to go deeper into the forest. I was careful, making sure that I embarked on my adventures almost as soon as I'd left the house, so that I had maximum time to explore without being caught by Mom and Dad. The day I first made it through the border, I was trying to time how long it took to walk through the trees. It was 15 minutes until I reached the clearing owned by Mr. Hinchcliffe, an elderly potato farmer to the left of us. He was known by the local people for being insular and quiet. Boredom was a killer. Chickens aren't so exciting when they're your day-to-day life, and there's only so much fun a kid can have on his own. It was a large, circular clearing, cut off from the rest of his land by a different species of tree to the ones in the forest. It's like they had been planted years before to create and keep the clearing separate and hidden. In the center of the circle was a man stood facing me, unmoving. I was terrified at first, convinced that Mr. Hinchcliffe was about to march me home for trespassing. I tried to conceal myself behind a tree whilst keeping an eye on the man, realizing that he hadn't moved an inch. It took me a moment, but the poles eventually gave it away. That and the lack of feet. The figure started from the ankles. The man in the clearing wasn't a man at all. He was a scarecrow. I was fascinated. I stayed behind my tree but strained my eyes to try and get a better look. My parents put scarecrows up around our own crops, but none of ours were ever as elaborate as the one stood in the middle of Mr. Hinchcliffe's clearing. He was realistic, more realistic than anything that I'd seen before. He wore a red checked shirt, a straw hat, and had a wide smile stitched across his face from the corners of his lips. I wanted to get closer, but as I started to emerge from the trees, I could feel his eyes on me and could have sworn that I saw his fingers move. I ran back through the woods to the farm, eager to get home and try to forget about what I'd seen, my little heart pounding. I didn't tell my parents about the scarecrow or the clearing, but as I laid in bed that night, all I could think about was that smile, stitched across his face. I spent hours that night convincing myself that scarecrows couldn't move. What I'd seen must have been the wind. I was just freaking out over nothing. I tried to stop myself going back, but I desperately wanted to get a closer look. I wondered what Mr. Hinchcliffe had used to make his scarecrow look so realistic, and my curiosity eventually got the best of me. 3 days after my initial discovery, I left the farm and made my way through the same dense section of woods until I reached the clearing again. I stopped behind the same tree, inspecting the scarecrow, until I'd gathered the bravery to get a little closer. Mr. Hinchcliffe's creation was even more spectacular up close. I couldn't work out what material he had used to make the face. It was like something out of a film. I touched the skin to try and understand what it was, but I couldn't. It felt like my own, just colder. I was in complete awe. The smile had been hand-stitched into the skin like material. It must have taken the old man hours. If the scarecrow had ever had feet, they had been buried in the dirt to try and help him stand. Poles were driven into the ground behind him and tied to his torso, keeping him propped up and secured. The longer I looked at the scarecrow, the more I started to feel like he were alive in ways. I was certain that he occasionally blinked and that his chest rose and fell. I was cautious and more than a little unsettled, but I took my time and inspected him as much as I could. Walking back to the farm through the forest, I couldn't get the scarecrow out of my thoughts. I struggled to make conversation over dinner, my mind completely filled with that stitched-up smile. I became obsessed. I returned every day for the next 3 weeks. The clearing became my place of solace, and the scarecrow that stood there my best friend. I would sit by his planted ankles, reading and drawing in my sketchbook. I named the scarecrow Peter, and I spoke to him whenever I could. I told him my deepest thoughts and feelings, cried to him when I was sad, and spent every moment that I could with him. I was careful not to sit in the clearing for too long, and always returned to the farm before my parents felt I was gone too long. I wished I could spend more time with Peter. It's sad when I think back to what a lonely kid I must have been to spend so much time with an object, a glorified effigy of a human. With every visit, the rising and falling of Peter's chest lessened. I stopped catching him blinking and his skin started to sag and gray after a few days of rain. I knew it must just be me getting used to him, realizing that he was never going to spring to life and answer me like a real friend, but it still made me a little sad. After a while, Peter's magic was gone. I would go and visit like always, but it didn't feel the same. The clearing was as empty as the rest of my life, and my propped-up friend in the middle was in a sorry state. The stitched smile barely held itself in place, and lumps of the material that made up his skin had started to dry and fall off. He couldn't even scare the birds away anymore, and often had multiple perched on his straw hat and shoulders, pecking at his face. One day, towards the end of that summer, I made my way through the clearing to find it empty. Peter was gone. There wasn't a trace of him left, bar the pole, that still stuck firmly in the ground. Despite the fact that my initial fascination with Peter had already depleted it, still felt like a loss. My parents couldn't understand why I was so withdrawn. I was grieving for someone that had never actually existed. 8 years old, and I already understood what it was to mourn a friend. I visited the clearing multiple times and it remained empty. School restarted and the autumn hit, bringing with it ice-cold winds that would frost the entire land. I spent less time outside and barely visited Mr. Hinchcliffe's clearing through the winter. By the time we reached the next summer, Peter and the time I'd spent with my silent friend was all but forgotten. It was by chance, on a sunny day, that I decided to walk through the woods one more time to my old sanctuary. I didn't expect it. I thought that part of my life was over. But there she was, an entirely new scarecrow, propped up just like Peter had been, ankles pressed firmly into the ground with poles behind her. She wore a different outfit, dungarees and a yellow check shirt, but the straw hat was unmistakably the same. Her chest rose and fell gently, just like Peter's once had, and her eyes appeared to move barely millimeters as I looked into them. It was almost impossible to see, but I was sure that she was alive. She gave me hope that I wouldn't have to spend a summer lonely and sad on the farm. Her stitched smile gave me the same familiar comforting feeling as a warm, hot chocolate on a chilly night. The process repeated just like it had with Peter. As the weeks passed, she started to look more haggard and less alive. The magic became less, the loneliness returned, and eventually, she disappeared entirely. Every year would be the same. Summer would come, and with it, Mr. Hinchcliffe would build a new scarecrow. They came in every age, shape, and gender. A new friend that I knew would wither and vanish just like the others. Regardless, I grew attached to every single one of them. As I got older and my parents awarded me more freedom, I was able to spend more time in the town with friends that spoke back. After a while, I started to forget about the scarecrows entirely, favoring girls and nights out to sitting with inanimate objects. Years passed by, and I left home to take a degree in art. University changed my life. For the first time, I had a group of friends around me all the time, ones that weren't planted in the ground. I moved in with them and only went home for Christmas. I never forgot about Mr. Hinchcliffe's scarecrows. They were my lifeline for so long. But I did move on. I didn't need them anymore. It's been 3 years since I last spent a summer on the farm, and lockdown has forced me back here. When my housemates all returned to their families, I couldn't bear the idea of just me in the house, so I did the same. I wasn't intending to visit the clearing. In fact, it's been years since I really thought about it. I've been too wrapped up in a social life that I never had as a kid. It was only when my mother bought up her new friend Linda, who now lives at the farm to the left, that I was reminded of my childhood secret, one that I now wish I could erase. What happened to Mr. Hinchcliffe? I asked, my heart sinking at the sudden realization that I would never get to see another one of his amazing creations. My mother hung her head, trying to plan a response. It was awful, Charlie. All over the local news. He stopped responding to his sister's calls last year, and after a while she sent local police to do a welfare check. When they arrived, he wasn't in the house, so they started searching the land and they found him, collapsed in a wooded bit just the other side of our trees. He'd died of a heart attack. Why would that make the news? I asked, a bead of sweat running down my neck, as I imagined Mr. Hinchcliffe, dead in the clearing. My clearing. My mother's face somehow lowered further. He wasn't alone, Charlie. They found a woman strapped to a pole next to his body. He'd been injecting her with some sort of drug that kept her completely paralyzed while conscious. He'd planted her feet in the ground to keep her upright and dressed her up like a scarecrow. Police combed the land and found 45 bodies buried. He'd been at it for years. I felt bile rising in my throat. My mind started to connect dots that I'd never imagined. What happened to the girl? I asked. She survived, barely. When they finally got her conscious, she wrote a letter explaining that she'd been strapped to that pole for 2 weeks before she was found. Hinchcliffe took every precaution possible to keep her alive up there. Worst of all, she can only communicate through writing now after what he did to her face. The sick F cut her mouth up, only to stitch it back into a smile